Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started here in just a moment.
Welcome, everybody. If you would like to put your name, city, state, organization, and role in the chat, we'll be right with you. Great. Again, welcome to those of you that are just joining us. If you want to put your name, city and state where you're located, your organization, and your role in the chat, we'll get going. Hi, and welcome to those of you that are passionate about school-based health. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on patient-centered care in school-based health centers. We appreciate that you're joining us, and we have great content prepared for you today that will be presented by our wise speakers. Additionally, I wanted to take a moment to mention this session will be recorded, and the recording, along with the slides, will be posted on our website and in additional email follow-ups. My name is Mandy LeBlanc. I'm a consultant for School-Based Health Alliance. Many of you here are familiar with our work, but if you're not, I wanted to give you a quick overview of who we are. We are a national organization that works to support and advance school-based healthcare. We do this through policy work. We offer standards to the field. We do data collection, and we provide training, technical assistance, and consultation to support school-based health centers from the planning stage all the way up through expansion and improvement. Before I move on to the learning objectives today, I wanted to review some housekeeping and reminders. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. You can use the chat at the of the function and ask any questions you might have, and we'll answer those at the end. We will have a portion at the end of the session for questions and answers. If you wish to have closed captioning turned on, there should be a button on your screen that either says CC or closed captioning. We also have a set of evaluation questions at the end of the webinar that we encourage you to complete, as it helps us to provide the best content and tailor it to the voices of those in the field. Here are our learning objectives for today. And again, my name is Mandy LeBlanc. I'm a contractor with School-Based Health Alliance, and I'd like to introduce our panelists today.
Go first. Hi there. My name is Donnie Greco, and I'm associate here at the School-Based Health Alliance, and I'll pass it over to Addie.
Hi, everyone. Addie Vanswell, and I'm a director here at the School-Based Health Alliance.
All right, and I'm Dr. Jacqueline Christensen. I'm Senior Vice President working with our Quality Research and Evaluation Department here at School-Based Health Alliance.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So today we're going to talk about patient-centered care within the framework of the healing-centered approach. While we recognize this may not be what you think of when you hear patient-centered care, we want to acknowledge that this approach will help you support your work with students and families and truly is patient-centered. So the healing-centered approach really focuses on the whole person It recognizes that in order for somebody to be at their best, you really have to address several different things. So, looking at someone's emotional, mental, physical, and social needs all at the same time will really help enhance that patient-centered care and work. It really moves beyond viewing challenges as personal struggles and really recognizes the importance and the value of community and shared experiences. They do this often through growth and recovery. And so it really is a strengths based approach that focuses on the healing process and focuses on how to get better and how to address some challenges that people may be experiencing. And then healing is not just about reducing its difficulties, but it really is about building those strengths and creating opportunities for growth. And so, one way that this approach really looks at that is through these three kind of different questions. So, as we started working with people, it would started with this: "What's wrong with you?" Now, if somebody asked you what's wrong with you, I personally have a pretty um, visceral reaction to that, right? Like that does not seem very open or accommodating, or I personally wouldn't really want to talk to somebody if somebody just said, "What's wrong with you?" Right? And so this idea has kind of shifted over time. So instead of saying what's wrong with you, there was a movement to say, "What happened to you?" Which much better, in my opinion, in terms of being willing to start to say like, oh, they're seeing me as an individual, they're seeing me beyond my experiences, and they're recognizing that maybe something happened. And then with the healing centered approach, it takes it a step further to really ask the question of what's right with you. So, what is going well? I think sometimes we focus so much on the negatives that it can sometimes be intimidating for students and families to really recognize that there is hope and that there is opportunity for that growth. So, kind of shifting, getting away from the what's wrong with you, shifting more to the what's happened to you, and then also incorporating that healing centered approach around what's right with you. Next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just going through some of the core elements of the healing centered approach. So what it does is it really encourages capacity building, um, positive development, and fosters a sense of awareness and allowing someone to feel kind of whole together as one person. So that first one, that holistic support, what I mean here is looking at the physical and emotional components that impact our well-being. So looking at the whole person. Student voice and agency. So this is really where we want to ask students what they're feeling, what they're seeing, how they're being impacted about the world around us, and really encourage their leadership. So strengthen their leadership skills, really encourage them to speak up and ask them the questions. 9 times out of 10, the young person will give you a really candid response, whether you want to hear it or not. And so, really asking for their opinion, I think, is really important. As I had mentioned on a previous slide, I talked a little bit about the strengths-based approach. So this is really focusing on the positives and focusing on what's going well versus kind of focusing on those negative experiences. For affirmations, this is really where we are recognizing and honoring students from all different backgrounds. And then with the community and collective healing piece, this really fosters a sense of collaboration and connection to the community. So sometimes when I was working in a clinic, I would be so focused on the individual that was sitting in front of me, but it was also important for me to realize that that student is part of a larger system. So they're part of that that school community, their home environment, everything that kind of relates to what is happening with them individually. There are aspects that are impacted on outside of that as well. And then interdisciplinary partnerships, this really just kind of highlights the need to partner with teachers, counselors, families, social workers, community organizations, really coming together as a team to help support the young people that you work with. So why does this even matter? I think that it matters for a lot of different reasons, and there's 4 reasons here on the slide. But it really allows for students to um, kind of help shape their own health, behavior, and engagement. So it really puts them at the center of that. And it really fosters this idea between well-being and connection rather than those deficits. So school-based health centers really can provide a vital role in helping students overcome the challenges and really thrive in their own ways and in their own communities. So there has been lots and lots of research on how supportive environments improve mental health outcomes and academic success. So again, I kind of go back to how are you engaging with people? How are you asking the questions? If you're coming at it from a punitive or a deficit-based approach, a student may not be as open, they may not feel as supported, and it makes it a lot more difficult for them to make progress. And so, really being that person to kind of open up the door and provide that support really can improve their academics long term. So I wanted to provide an example or a metaphor, so to speak, around how students are really at the center of our work. And the way that we kind of can look at it is like they are a plant in a garden with their own needs, strengths, and potential. And that sometimes students might need more sunlight, so they might need a little bit more support. They may need more resources or water. And then they really need that enriched soil or that nurturing environment to help grow and thrive. So, as educators and healthcare providers, we really act as the gardeners, so to speak. So, really working with the students to help with conditions, to help people grow, and not to just focus on the past struggles, but also highlight how those struggles can help them grow as a person. And so, really, the healing centered approach nurtures connections, helps students bloom in their own time and way. And you can be there right alongside them to help them grow. So, I'm going to pass it over to Jacqueline, where she'll talk a little bit more about some risk and protective factors.
Thank you, Addie. So I love the garden metaphor. It's one of my favorites because it really is speaking to just the individual needs of each child. And so whenever we're thinking about child development, when we're thinking about how we're supporting the kids who are coming into school-based health centers, we are thinking about not just that child though, but also their context, right? So we call that a biopsychosocial approach, right? Which is just a really fancy way of saying we're thinking about the person, we're thinking about their context and environment, we're thinking about everyone who interacts with that child, we're thinking about the system they're growing up in, right? We're thinking about the school they go to. So we're trying to really think about all the pieces at the same time if possible, right? Because no child is growing up in just some magical bubble that they don't interact with anyone, right? So in that vein, we want to think about risk factors and protective factors. So I hope most of you are familiar with those terms. Harvard Center for the Developing Child often illustrates this as on balance scales, like a set of scales with if you weigh too much toward the risk factors, it can start to be overwhelming for the child. So we want to work to increase both the quantity and the quality of the protective factors to help offset that, right? So if we're thinking about the risk factors at the individual level, remember that that can come in a variety, there's a whole continuum there from just the biology of that child, who they were born, their individual differences. My daughter was born with a lot of auditory and visual sensitivities, for example, right? So she needed an environment that was more supportive of that, right? You have kids who have they're just born into the world where they may be more sensitive to certain things, right, or more reactive to certain things. So we want to be mindful of who is this kid, right? And every kid has their own temperament, they have their own individual differences, they have their own personalities, and they're going to respond to this context in myriad different ways, right? And then we want to think about the protective factors at that individual level as well. So maybe this is a kid who bounces back more easily than other kids, or maybe this is a kid who goes into a stress response more easily than other kids, right? So you have these differences at the individual level that can either be risk factors or protective factors, and we do our best to help build the capacities at the individual level. Then at the family level, we think about what are the risk factors, with those who are interacting with this kid at home on a daily basis. Do they feel safe at home? Are there people being unkind at home? Are they experiencing neglect or abuse, and the different things that many folks at school-based health centers are mandated reporters, right? We have to be on the ball with what's happening at home. Alternatively, are there family members, they could be immediate or extended family members, that are protective, right? That are there to support them. And we see it time and time again, even in a case where a child has experienced some sort of loss or have a risk factor that's related to a family member. We often see that they say, but my aunt, my grandma, my grandfather, my somebody was my bastion of support during this time, right? They swooped in and they were there to help me. At school or work, same thing, right? Are they experiencing bullying at school? Do they have a lack of friends at school? What's happening at school that are risk factors, right? Where maybe they're not challenged enough. Maybe they're too challenged. Maybe, we're not sure what's happening there that could be impacting them negatively, but we need to pay attention. And then also what's protective. Is there a relationship? Is there a special, a teacher? Is there a class they love? Is that, what's good at school, right, that we can hang on to and notice. Similarly, think about the community level, right? Do they feel safe in their neighborhood? Do they feel unsafe? Do they have transportation to get to school, or is that tricky, right? And then what do they feel protected by in their neighborhood? Maybe they have a lot of parks at their disposal. Maybe they have a community center or a religious institution that they're involved in that makes them feel included and that they belong, right? So, and then of course, circumstances and life events. And these can be one-off experiences that can go either direction, right? So again, on the risk factor side, it could be something like a death. It could be something like a house fire or something that really turned their world upside down, or it could be something very positive that went along with that. Maybe as a result, they got into better housing, or maybe they or it could be completely unrelated to a negative event, and maybe a relative moved closer. So now they have this extra support that they didn't have before, right? And it would tie into one of the other categories. But I belabor this slide because as we're thinking about screening, as we're thinking about addressing these kids, we really want to dig in and look at the whole child. As Addie said, right? We're looking at the whole picture. We're not just looking at the plant, we're looking at the entire context around the plant so that we can really support them. Next slide. So as we're doing this, so you have a kid who walks in, what are we going to pay attention to? And I think one of the things that the step we often miss is we say, oh, well, we've checked for all these risk factors and we're looking at all these negative health outcomes. How did we get from A to B? Right? And there's a piece in the middle, and that piece is that oftentimes those risk factors are stress inducing, and they will put our bodies into stress responses that are not healthy, and adaptive. So all of us have a set of stress responses that is healthy and adaptive. It's why we would run away from a bear if, one came after us. It's part of our sleep-awake cycle. So if you think to yourself right now, did you get a good night's sleep last night? You don't have to answer aloud, but think to yourself, right? And are you calm and alert right now? Are you focused? Are you paying attention to me talking? Or are you zoned out? Which I can't see you all, so I don't know, right? But if I could, right? Are you zoned out, or are you stressed about something? Are you feeling anxious or nervous or frustrated, right? That's inhibiting your ability to focus. So if we're calm alert, we should be feeling safe, right? And good, healthy, protective relationships can help us feel safe. And then we have healthy stress responses, which is where we can go into challenge, but then we can bounce back. Think of a rubber band. We go and come back, go and come back, right? You could be frustrated and you can come back. You can be tired and you can come back to that place of safety. So when a kid is walking into a school-based health center, we want to notice, is this kid what we're calling green zone? Do they feel safe? Does their body look relaxed? Do they make good eye contact? Are they showing joy? Do they have the capacity to laugh, right? And then do they have a healthy set of stress responses? So they say, oh man, I was so frustrated when my teacher said X, Y, and Z. Or I was so mad when my friend did this. Or, hey, bud, you look a little tired. Yeah, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Okay, right? And that's fine. But then what we want to see is, does this child look like they're constantly under threat? So we're not seeing the green, we're not seeing the safety. They're overreactive to everything. They're explosive, or they look like they're just tired all the time, or they look zoned out all the time, right? And if we're seeing that that rubber band is not bouncing back to that place of safety, that's when we go, ooh, those scales, there's too much on one side. Something is pushing these scales down, right? So next slide. And what that means is that it's impacting this child's ability to learn, right? So when we're green, we can learn. If you're green right now, I can't see you, but if you are, then you're taking this in, right? It's going to stick in your brain. But if you're not green, just press the button, Donnie, a couple times. One, there we go. Then you need support, right? Because it means, and there's little colors there to show you, right? If you're what we would call red zone, and this comes from the work of the neurorelational framework by Dr. Connie Lawless and Janice Turnbull, but we'll use these colors. It's a little different than zones of regulation, but that's a conversation for another day. So this is not just emotions. This is actually physically related to your autonomic nervous system and what's happening in your body. So if we're red zone, we could be exploding or flitting or bouncing around. If we're blue zone, we're zoned out, we're not paying attention. And if we're what we call combo zone, maybe our shoulders are tense, our eyes are open, our nostrils are flared, we're nervous, there's tension in our body, right? And again, you can have all of these. They're healthy, they're adaptive, but if we're stuck there, if we're going there too often, we're not learning, right? So when you have the teacher who's saying they're falling asleep in class, they're not paying attention, it doesn't seem to be sticking what's happening. We're seeing explosive behavior. The kid flipped a desk, right? Addie's going to be talking in a second about rethinking behavior, but this is what's underlying it. Next slide, Donnie. So what can we do, right? If we know that about thinking about what's happening with kids, are they feeling safe, right? Because it comes down to safety and threat, right? And we're rethinking everything. We're going to shift away from this idea of, are they being compliant? Are they being non-compliant? We're shifting to what's underneath this behavior. All behavior is communication, right? We're actually going to start not with them, but with us, which a lot of times when I've done trainings for Head Start teachers and school teachers and providers and mental health providers, I always say, it doesn't, you want some magic wand. I don't have a magic wand. What I have is to start with yourself, right? Because if you are not green, you cannot help a kid be green too, right? So the first tangible thing when we're thinking about patient-centered care, when we're thinking about healing-centered engagement, when we're thinking about how do we shift our lens as practitioners, is to start by noticing your own stress response. Notice your sleep. Notice right now. Take a moment, right? Close your eyes. Feel what's happening in your body, right? And then reflect, right? What experiences or antecedents, what may be pushing you into a stress response, right? And can you come back, right? So this is, we think of when people talk about being hangry, right? I would ask you right now to raise your hand. Are you a person who gets hangry, right? You're so hungry, you start to snap at people. That's physiological, right? That's like what's happening in your body. And that's a stress response, right? And how do you get back to green? Maybe you eat a snack, right? Or maybe you need to go on a walk. Maybe you need to get some sunshine. Maybe you need to take a break, right? And so if you can practice, put into, we talk about walking the walk, right? How do you get yourself back to green? And when you figure that out, you help students figure that out, right? So that's where we start first thinking about supporting the staff. How are we supporting ourselves and the staff in our health centers, in our school-based health centers, so that they are green, so that they can recognize when children are not, so that they can intervene effectively. All right, Addie, I'm going to hand it back to you to continue this thread of what we can do.
All right, awesome. So some of this stuff might seem a bit obvious, but I think it's important to remember that the little things do go a really long way. So prior to coming to SBHA, I worked in a school-based health center for 12 years. And I can't tell you how surprised students would be when I would just simply greet them by name. So even if they weren't there um to see me as a social worker, they could have been there for a physical, but I knew them because I helped with the scheduling. I would remember them by name and I would say, "Hey Johnny, it's really great to see you today." And they kind of took a step back to be like, "Oh wait, like she remembers who I am." And so I use that as an example because I think it can be so powerful. Just because they feel heard, they feel acknowledged, and I don't even really know the kid very well, but just greeting him by name went a really long way. Um, Using your nonverbals to show that you're listening. So I think this is very much coming from my social work background, right? But really kind of those smiles, those nods, the leaning in as you're listening to what the young person is telling you can be really helpful. Consistency is another really big one. So a lot of the students that I used to work with, um, both in the school-based health center and in my time working in the child welfare system, consistency was huge. So unfortunately for many of the students and young people I worked with, they weren't used to people following through. They weren't used to people saying, "I'll be there at 5," and then you actually show up at 5 p.m., right? And so showing that little bit of consistency can go a long way in building that relationship. Giving choices when possible. Sometimes our students don't have a whole lot of choice, and that could be for a lot of different reasons. But providing them with the opportunity to say, "Oh, I want to work on this today or that today," versus them coming in and say, "We're going to talk about your relationship with your parents." Well, maybe that's not what they actually want to talk about today, which is totally fair. So while you may need to address that at some point, you really have to reflect back and figure out, what does the student need at this point, and am I able to give them some of those choices? Having clear expectations and routines. I think this is really helpful. In our school-based health center, we had a lobby that students would often want to just sit there because they felt like it was a calm space and it was quiet. The cafeteria was super chaotic and really stress inducing. And so oftentimes students would come down to the health center and we had very specific rules and expectations. They couldn't just be on their phones on TikTok, doing TikToks in the lobby of the health center. Like that wasn't going to happen, right? So making sure that you just have those clear routines, expectations. Eventually, we were able to move them to a different space, supervised by the school-based health center, just to allow our lobby space to open on up. But I do think having those clear routines, expectations, letting them know what to expect when they come in for an appointment, I think can go a long way as well. Visual cues. So having things both in writing and on posters, I think is really helpful. Sometimes when I would notice that I would talk to a student at length about the consent form or just different policies, and I would notice that they would space out. So I'd be like, okay, like, but look at this poster. And then that was a way to get them a little more engaged in the content. Um, give control when possible. So again, this kind of goes back to the choices, but allowing them to kind of take control over their healthcare, and especially as they're getting older and transitioning to adult healthcare, like they're gonna have to make those decisions, and so allowing to make those decisions with their parents, right? But if there are ways for them to make some decisions, I think that can be really helpful. And then showing genuine interest. So kids and adolescents pick up on anything and everything. So if you um, kind of goes back to what Jacqueline was saying about that piece around if you're not in the green, the students are going to know that you're not in the green, right? And so really be genuine, be engaged. And sometimes, there were days that I had an off day and I had a student that, I met with really regularly and she's like, something's not right today. And I'm like, okay, yes. And we're not going to talk about that. I'm still interested in working with you and I'm doing my best to get to my green. But I say that, or I share that to say, students know and they know when you care and they know when you don't. And so just showing that genuine interest really helps build those relationships. So I think it's also important to think about, this goes along with the three kind of key questions I talked about in the beginning. But to kind of begin to shift our language to be more strengths-based, to be more healing centered. And so kind of even rephrasing the way in which we are identifying behavior. So instead of looking at it as difficult or challenging, recognizing it as this is just the way that they're communicating, and we can maybe work on how they're communicating, right? But just really label it more as communication and not putting that negative spin on it. Um, I think it's also important to kind of look at shifting from compliance and non-compliance language to what's the stress response behind this behavior. So behind every behavior, there's a reason for it. And so really diving a little bit deeper and understanding kind of the function of that behavior for that student. I think it's always helpful to be curious. I think being curious and asking questions, asking good open-ended questions, can go a really long way in getting young people to open up. And so there's a few examples on this slide. I won't go through each of them, but maybe just a couple. So if they refuse to talk, they might just not feel safe. They may not know what to say. As a behavioral health provider, therapy can be new and it can be scary and it can be, they might not know what to expect. And so you may have to give that young person a session or two or 10 to really feel open and comfortable and safe in opening up. I remember there were several students that took a few sessions, and by a few, I mean a lot of them, to really even talk to me about what was really going on. So they would talk to me about surface level things. They'd be like, oh yeah, I'm really stressed out about this test. Not to say that that wasn't um, impacting them, but what was truly going on was things that were going on at home or things that were really kind of like underlying depression or underlying anxiety. And so they were talking at that surface level until they truly felt safe to open up and talk. Um, and then the last one I want to point out is the tantrum is uncalled for. Actually, it's a stress response. And I think it can be a way to ask ourselves, like, I'm wondering what they actually need. If they're tantruming, it's probably because they're trying to get somebody's attention, and they need something, right? And so being that adult to say, to take a step back and say, oh, okay, they're stressed out. They need something. What can I do to intervene, or what can I do to assist? So a few additional things that health centers can do. We kind of have a lot on this slide here, but I'm going to try to highlight kind of three main areas. So policies, partnerships, and space. Um, so aligning your staff training and policies on healing-centered approaches. So one example that you could do this is having your staff attend a local mental health first aid training. Many nonprofits in communities across the country will offer this training for free. And so it is a really good way for clinicians and non-clinicians to really understand how they can address mental health. Also taking a look at policies, procedures, to make sure that they're aligned with the Healing Center framework. So again, not asking the question of what's wrong with you, but really kind of shifting and saying, what's right with you? How can we support you? How can we navigate the challenges that you may be presenting with? Partnering with the school and community organizations. So I feel like we could do an entire webinar on partnerships, and believe we have, right? So really looking at the ways in which you're connecting with the school. So supporting local school events, going to the basketball game, going to the football game, right? Like showing that you are visible in the school and in the school community, I think is really helpful. Also kind of partnering with community-based organizations. So I was often the person who wore 12 different hats at my school-based health center. And I don't think I'm alone in that, right? And so really knowing what your capacity is and where you can kind of build some strong community connections to help support families and students. And then adapt the space. So I know sometimes we don't have a lot of control over the space in which we are given within schools. But I had a very small, I don't even know the size, probably less than a bedroom size of an office. And it had these bright fluorescent lights. I had a pretty negative reaction to those bright fluorescent lights. So did I turn them on? No. I brought in my own lamps. I made it much more comforting. I had kind of fun chairs that students could sit in. I had fidgets. So they that were readily available for all students. And so really just allowing just the little ways to make the space a little bit more comfortable. The idea is that we want them to feel safe and welcome and encouraged to seek help. And so not just in the social worker's office, but also in those provider rooms. And so thinking about even just the posters that we have on the walls in our clinics and how we encourage students and families to seek the support. So I wanted to pause for a moment to see if people could maybe write in the chat about how your health center is making your physical space more welcoming for students and their families. All right, so having a cookout at the blue and white game at the start of football season, love that. Music to sit and collect themselves as needed, also love that. Um, that's great. always had snacks. So I was known to have the snacks in my office. So students would, um, school lunch wasn't always the best. And so they didn't bring anything with them to school to eat. So, by midday they're starving. And so I bought some snacks to help with the address the food access issues, but also um that was a way to really kind of get to know other students too, because then they would walk out of the health center with a snack and then they'd be like, "Where'd you get that from?" And then I started, and hence why I was able to greet everybody by name, because I got to know quite a few students that were even beyond my caseload. Um, so love Youth Advisory Council, a lemon tree. Love that so much. All right, great. Um, yes, I also became popular because of those snacks. So if you have the budget for it, I would recommend. That came out of my own personal budget for a while. All right, well, keep the comments coming in the chat. I think this is I think you guys have some really great ideas. I really love that lemon tree, so I may steal that in a future training.
Yeah, I agree. And, as I'm reading these comments, what I'm noticing is there's a lot of sensory-based strategies that have the function of helping us regulate our bodies, right? So whether it's lighting, there's also things like food, right? Preventing the hangry situation, thinking about sound. And there's also sort of what we would call an emotional or feelings or relevance based strategies for, I feel welcome. I feel like I belong. I feel like I'm part of it, right? I'm going to put positive statements here so that you read it and your brain goes, oh, this is nice, right? So different types, buckets, if you will, of strategies here to help folks feel green, right? Which would be the goal. So what else can we do? So one of the things that many of you are probably doing, but if not, no time like the present, is thinking about screening. So, the caveat here, of course, is we want to think about the whole child, right? So screening is important, but it's one piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole picture, right? And even if you were to use 5 different screening tools or 7 different screening tools, it's still not the whole picture. Right, so it's giving us pieces of information, often cross-sectionally or retrospectively, right, to look at this child's past or to look at where this child is today or over the past week. And that gives us important information so that we can perhaps make decisions. But it also is just one piece of the puzzles, right? So whenever possible, it should give us enough information that we know where we need to find out more. So with that in mind, we think about the different domains in which we can do screening and assessment, right? So we can think about the social influences on health. So what is happening, again, thinking about that, the biopsychosocial, right? What is happening in this child's environment that could be impacting their stress levels and their well-being overall. And so there are tools like Prepare, iHelp, etc., that can be used to support that. We also, many of you, I'm sure, do mental health screening, whether that's for depression, for anxiety, etc. Some tools kind of cut across here, but you have things screening tools to look at risk assessments. So, as well as their history of stress-inducing events, whether those were acute events or chronic and ongoing situations that could be resulting in stress responses. So, I know some sites will use the ACE questionnaire. The ACE questionnaire is lovely. Remember, it's a score. It's helpful, but it should not be the only thing, right? It gives us a snapshot, a little picture of what's happening, and we can look at it over time. Obviously, you don't want that number to get bigger, but the challenge with the ACE questionnaire, of course, is that you can't make the score go any lower. So it's helpful and, right, we take that information with a grain of salt. And then again, thinking of those scales, we don't want to only be assessing the negative. We also want to make sure we're assessing for strengths. We want to make sure we're assessing for protective factors and what's going well for that child also. Next slide. We can also think about the role of care coordination. And again, we have whole webinars dedicated to building partnerships, but just thinking about as you assess this child's needs and their strengths and set goals for this child, how is their voice included? We're thinking family voice and choice. We're thinking about how do you have somebody at your center to close the loop if you do make referrals, so you're not just doing cold handoffs. We want warm handoffs, but more than just a handoffs, we need to follow up, right? Collaboration with community partners is critical to have those relationships, right? So you say, hey, I'm going to connect you with my friend Betsy down at the food bank. She's going to talk to you about X, Y, and Z, right? That there is it, and if you don't have those relationships, that you're spending time building those relationships so that when you need them, you have them. Right. And again, really having some good, deep collaboration with the school mental health teams is just so critical. Next slide. So I make sure that we stay within our time window here. Again, thinking about the whole child, I decided to inundate you with pictures instead of words here. But what we want to think about is that we're supporting, after we've assessed the needs, how are we supporting this child from multiple angles, right? So if we're thinking about how are we helping this child feel safe, feel green, right? We often are thinking about things that are coming from the outside in. And so things like their environment, are they getting enough sleep? Do they have enough food? Are their basic social needs met? We also might think very deeply about their physiological regulation in terms of medication management, all the way down to the neurochemicals, right? Is their brain doing what it needs to do so that they can get green and be regulated, right? So again, are we assessing their sleep? Are we supporting them if they need medication? There's also interventions that cut across, right? Treatment approaches that cut across these domains. So something like body-mind interventions. When we think of mindfulness, we think of yoga, we think of even certain martial arts practices, right? Where there's a piece where you're focusing on what's happening in your body and you're moving your body, right? And any of those exercises that regulate your breathing come back to regulating your nervous system. Okay, so those do work hand in hand. Similarly, when we're thinking about the sensory system, we want to be accommodating for sensory sensitivities or things that we know are antecedents for what could result in a stress response. So paying attention to that. As well as, do they need to be connected with OT or PT or other developmental supports to really address sensory needs that might go beyond just a slight shift in their environment, right? And then we think about, when we talk about interventions, we often think of the ones here on the top, the reflective and meaning-making approaches, which is your more traditional psychotherapeutic interventions. Again, your mentalization-based interventions where you're sort of envisioning the world, changing how you might, feel about different situations, as well as your art-based therapies, which again sort of cross over into sensory. They sort of do a lot of double duty there, but when you're painting or you're creating, right, it's not just about product, it's about process. So that can really help kids kind of move into the next space and find their where their body feels safe. And then of course your cognitive social approaches. So this would be your cognitive behavioral treatments of many varieties. It is out of the scope of this 1 hour webinar to get deep into all of the evidence-based treatments that are out there, but there are lots, as well as social skill building. So my point of putting all this into one spot is to say, instead of just going immediately to, let's say, a cognitive behavioral approach, maybe you need that and a medication approach or helping address the sleep and a sensory need and cognitive therapy, right? That you're thinking very holistically about how you can support the child, their individual differences, as well as broadening out to maybe other environmental supports they may need so that they can get regulated and feel safe. That was a lot. Here is a happy, sort of closing thought. I hate reading off slides, but I will read it aloud on principle. So healing happens in relationships, right? Again, co-regulation is what happens to get everyone to green and to build our capacity to have deeper relationships and be more deeply engaged, right? So it happens in relationships, in community, and through individual growth. Let's be the adults who create those spaces for our students. So with that, I think that puts us right in time for some questions.
That is correct. Feel free to put your questions in the chat now. And at the same time, we'll get a poll going. So if you put the questions in the chat, and I can tell you where to find additional resources. You can always get more information by going to the School-Based Health Alliance, sbhforall.org, then going to resources, then eLibrary, then BIPIC and TAP to find more information. And as you are putting your questions in the chat and figuring if finalizing the poll, thank you for answering those questions. We appreciate it. It helps us determine next steps. Also, save the date for our national conference, please. June 29th through July 1st. And also stay connected. These are our social media options. We would love it if you could follow us and hear about other upcoming webinars. We have a bunch coming up in the next couple months. We want to ensure you know about them. And now, if there are any questions in the chat, we can get to those. Does anybody have any questions? We can give it another couple minutes for the poll to get a few more people to answer. Only about half of you have completed the poll, so I believe that more of you can complete the poll to give us some good feedback and ensure we're delivering high quality content like our speakers did today. While we wait for the poll to finish up, here we go, yep. Looking for what is one thing you took away from today's webinar? Feel free to put that in the chat too. If you're a little shy about asking some questions, let us know what you learned. And we'll give it 2 more minutes for the chat, the poll. I'm seeing just over half of you have completed, and I believe more of you can. I'll ask the panelists some questions. Either one of you can answer this, Addie or Jacqueline. What are some common challenges in implementing patient-centered care in school-based health centers, and how can we overcome them?
Repeat it one more time. What are some common?
What are some common challenges in implementing patient-centered care in school-based health centers, and how can we overcome them? There's also a request for a photo of the lemon tree.
Go ahead, Addie.
Well, I do not have a photo of the lemon tree, so I would also love to see that. If you have one, that would be great. So I think one of the common challenges is really about shifting language, right? Is that I think in a lot of ways we were trained in certain ways, no matter what discipline you come from. So what you have done kind of naturally in your training and then working in an environment, I think making that language shift can sometimes be difficult. So I would say that's a challenge. But I think one that is you're able to overcome that pretty easily.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. The language thing, I used to have a slide somewhere, I'd have to find it deep in the recesses, of a bunch of words we often use to describe behavior. And if you actually look at them, none of them are actually behaviors, they're all adjectives. So like annoying, disruptive, frustrating, right? That we often use when we're talking about behavior. And none of them really actually address the behavior themselves or itself, right? And so if we actually look at the behavior, is it hitting? Is it walking away? Is it shouting, right? That helps us bring it back to the body and what's happening with that kid. So I would say that it is a big shift, right? It's a huge shift for how we write things, how we talk to other people about children, right? And teenagers. Um, and then the other thing I would probably add to, a challenge is just that it's hard to do as one person. You have to kind of turn the whole ship. So thinking about what you can really implement at a systemic level, it can be challenging. It's not impossible, but it's definitely one where you kind of have to have everybody on board. You can do something as a person, as an individual, but if you can get everybody, that helps.
Great. And while Christina is working on getting a picture of the lemon tree, and we have 63% completion of the poll. It's just 5 questions. If you haven't started yet, we'll leave it up a little bit longer. The final question I have before anyone else puts anything else in the chat is, what role can peer support or student-led initiatives play in fostering a patient-centered school environment?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the first way is having them involved, having them be at the table, having the conversations, figuring out what the students need, what they think can be improved upon. I think they have a lot of really great insight. So really making sure that they're at the table for all of the conversations. Obviously the ones that, confidentiality would be a concern, that maybe not at those tables, but I do think just generally, if your school-based health center does have a youth advisory council, or if you're interested in starting a youth advisory council, I think that can be a really great way to ensure that kind of student needs are put at the forefront and student voice is helping to inform those needs.
Yeah, agreed. I think there was a great we had a school-based health center do a great presentation on they had actually started by talking about sleep with students because that's a very, non-judgmental thing to talk about. And then they had students give input on what would be the best way to start addressing it with other students at the school. So they came up with their own campaigns and how they wanted to use social media. They had these little meme contests. It was really fun and engaging. And then they slowly got into some more mental health-y type topics. But then you had buy-in from the students who did the sleep portion, right? And you already had the engagement, and then it sort of rolled and trickled from there, and then it continued to grow, right? And that was at one of our sites that is in New York City. But I think there are creative ways when you invite them to the table, right? That you can really, they grow, they blossom like the plants and the flowers, right? You're providing that supportive environment, and they're able to do that.
Great. And we can wrap up by saying thank you, Christina. Donnie's provided his email address so that we can, if with your permission, get that photo of the lemon tree up and take the pressure off of you for sprinting to get it right now. We'll wrap up the poll and thank you for everybody for joining us. Thank you especially to Addie and Jacqueline for being our co-presenters today. And we'll stick around in case anybody has some final questions they want to ask more personally. Thank you.
I think if we have 2 minutes, if I could just read Hannah's question, just because I just saw it in there, so that way we can
Great.
get that. Hannah, I see you. Do you have any recommendations for like trauma-informed trainings that could help create a shared language for staff? So like building on the shift of language.
Oh yeah, there's tons out there. Um, the work that I was talking about, you can look up. It's the neurorelational framework, which sounds like a mouthful. I think the website is nrfcare.org. There are resources there. There's work by Mona Delahook, has some good workbooks and stuff for providers and practitioners with work on that. Bruce Perry's work, obviously, there's a lot of great stuff by him. There is NCTSN is a great resource for materials. But the NRF really talks about the common language piece. Stuart Shanker has something called Self-Reg. His work is also pretty good at making it very tangible, and his stuff kind of overlaps in that way a little bit. So feel free to reach out to us. We can try to give you more specifics at some point, but hopefully that's helpful. But the materials are out there. You just have to decide how deep you want to go. But yeah, the common language is huge, right? If you get that shared language and shared approach with staff, and then you start using it with students, you can see a really big shift. Yay, stay green. I see that
Yes,
comment.
absolutely.
Danielle.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. We really appreciate that. Slides and the recording will be out usually by next week. So we'll get you some resources. Christina, thank you so much. If you can send me that lemon tree, that's a popular one. And I want everyone to have a great day. Thanks all.